Deep in the jungles of Phuoc Thi Province, 1969, a Viet Cong intelligence officer writes a single urgent order to his commanders. If you see Australians, do not engage. This warning was never issued for American forces. Why did the enemy fear these soldiers more than the most powerful military on Earth? The year is 1966. American forces pour into South Vietnam by the hundreds of thousands. They bring with them the most advanced military technology ever deployed. B-52 bombers, helicopter gunships, artillery that can level entire grid squares, and unlimited ammunition. The strategy is simple and overwhelming. Search and destroy, find the enemy, bring massive firepower, win through attrition. It's warfare built on American industrial might and technological superiority. But there's a problem. The Viet Cong aren't fighting that kind of war. In the dense triple canopy jungle, American patrols move in company strength, sometimes battalion-sized formations. You can hear them coming from kilometers away. The metallic clink of equipment, the snap of branches, radio chatter, the distinctive thump of boots on jungle trails. The Viet Cong learned to read these sounds like a language. When they heard Americans approaching, they had options: fade into the jungle, set an ambush, avoid contact, and wait. The Americans would sweep through an area, count bodies, declare victory, and return to their fire bases. Days later, the Viet Cong would move back in. It was frustrating, exhausting warfare where the enemy controlled the tempo. Then something changed in the jungle, something the Viet Cong had never encountered before. Patrols that made no sound, soldiers who appeared like ghosts, materializing from the jungle without warning. Enemy fighters who moved through the darkness with the confidence of men who owned the night. Men who could track you for days without revealing themselves, studying your patterns, learning your routes, and then striking with surgical precision exactly when you were most vulnerable. The Viet Cong gave these soldiers a name: Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. They were Australian SAS. To understand why these men became the most feared soldiers in Vietnam, we need to go back 12 years earlier to another jungle, another war. The Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960. While America was fighting in Korea and enjoying post-war prosperity, Australian forces were deep in the rainforests of Malaya, fighting communist insurgents in one of the Cold War's forgotten conflicts. It was brutal, patient, unglamorous work. The enemy blended with the population. They controlled vast jungle areas. They had the advantage of terrain, local knowledge, and time. Sound familiar? But here's the difference. The British and Australian forces won. They won by learning to fight the insurgents on their own terms. Small patrol units living in the jungle for weeks at a time. Silent movement techniques that turned soldiers into shadows. Counter-insurgency tactics that separated guerrillas from their support base. Ambush techniques that reverse the psychological dynamic, making the hunters feel hunted. By the time Malaya achieved independence in 1960, Australian soldiers had mastered jungle warfare at a level the world had never seen. They had fought in conditions identical to Vietnam. They had won, and they remembered every lesson learned in blood. When the first Australian advisors arrived in South Vietnam in 1962, followed by combat units in 1966, they brought with them something American forces lacked: institutional memory of successful jungle counterinsurgency. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam began teaching South Vietnamese and American forces tactics that seemed almost supernatural: how to move through jungle without disturbing a single leaf, how to read the forest like a book, seeing the invisible signs of enemy presence, how to reverse track your own patrol to ensure you weren't being followed, how to exist in the jungle not as an invading force, but as part of the ecosystem itself. The Australian SAS took this to another level entirely. These weren't conventional infantry. These were operators selected for patience, discipline, and an almost predatory understanding of fieldcraft. Their selection course emphasized qualities that seemed counterintuitive for warriors: the ability to remain completely still for hours, the discipline to not speak for days at a time, the patience to track an enemy for a week before engaging, the confidence to operate in 4 to 6-man teams deep behind enemy lines with no support except what you carried on your back. Let me show you what this looked like in practice. A typical Australian SAS patrol in Phuoc Thi Province, 1969. 4 men, 1 patrol commander, 1 medic, 1 signaller, 1 forward scout. Their mission: reconnaissance deep in confirmed enemy territory. Intelligence suggests a major supply route is operating somewhere in this grid square. Find it. Report enemy strength. Avoid contact unless absolutely necessary. The patrol will last 10 days. They insert via helicopter at last light, deliberately landing 3 kilometers from their actual objective to confuse any observers. The helicopter barely touches down. The 4 men slip into the jungle like water disappearing into sand, and then they vanish. For 10 days, these 4 men will not speak above a whisper. They communicate primarily through hand signals developed to near telepathic efficiency. They move at a pace that would frustrate any American unit. 50 meters per hour is fast. Usually it's slower, because they're not just moving, they're reading. Every broken branch, every disturbed leaf, every footprint in the mud, every sign that another human has passed this way. They're not following trails, they're moving parallel to them, observing without exposing themselves. At night, they don't set up camp. They find a position with good sight lines, establish a watch rotation, and remain absolutely silent. No fires. Cold rations only. Human waste is carefully buried. Nothing is left to indicate their presence. By day 3, they've found the trail, but they don't report it immediately. First, they need to understand it. What time of day does it see traffic? How many fighters? What are they carrying? Which direction are they moving? For 3 more days, they watch. They're so close to enemy soldiers they can hear conversations, so perfectly concealed that Viet Cong patrols walk within meters and never suspect anything. The patrol commander makes detailed notes, sketches the trail system, counts every enemy fighter, records every detail that intelligence will need. On day 7, they have what they came for: a major supply route moving weapons and ammunition from Cambodia into operational areas. The patrol commander makes a decision. They could call in an airstrike right now, but that would reveal their position and compromise future operations in this area. Instead, they mark the location for a future ambush by Australian infantry. They'll hit this supply line when the enemy thinks they're safe, creating maximum psychological impact. The patrol has been in position for days. The enemy has no idea they're there. The message this sends is more valuable than any single engagement. Nowhere is safe. We can appear anywhere, anytime. The extraction is as silent as the insertion. They move to the pickup zone using a different route, carefully obscuring their tracks. The helicopter arrives exactly at the planned moment. 45 seconds on the ground. 4 shadows materialize from the jungle and disappear into the helicopter. They leave behind no evidence they were ever there, except for one thing. In 10 days, this 4-man patrol covered over 30 kilometers of enemy-controlled jungle, gathered intelligence that will save Australian lives, and never fired a shot. That's mastery. Compare this to American operations in the same time period. A company-sized sweep and clear operation. 150 men moving through the jungle in a formation designed to make contact with the enemy. They're supported by artillery on call, helicopter gunships overhead, and medical evacuation ready at a moment's notice. It's an impressive display of military power. But to the Viet Cong, it's also completely predictable. They can hear this force coming from kilometers away. They know approximately where it's going because American operations follow patterns. They can choose whether to fight or fade away. Often, they choose to fade. The Americans sweep through, find nothing, and move on. In military terms, this is success. Area cleared. Enemy denied the use of terrain, but nothing has fundamentally changed. Now imagine you're a Viet Cong soldier in the same area. You've avoided American patrols successfully for weeks. You understand their patterns. You know when they patrol, where they patrol, and how they patrol. You've even ambushed a few. You're confident in your ability to survive in this jungle. You're eating breakfast with your unit in what you think is a secure area when the man next to you suddenly slumps over. You don't hear the shot because the Australian who fired it is 300 meters away, perfectly camouflaged, and using noise discipline you can't comprehend. Before you can react, 2 more men are down. You return fire wildly, spraying bullets into jungle that reveals nothing, and then silence. You search for an hour. Nothing. No blood trail. No tracks. No indication anyone was ever there. Did they leave? Are they still watching you? Are they moving to cut off your retreat? The uncertainty is more terrifying than the casualties, because now you know. Nowhere is safe. They can see you when you can't see them. They can kill you before you know they're there. This is the psychological warfare advantage the Australians created. It wasn't about body counts, it was about fear, about making the enemy feel hunted in their own jungle, about reversing the psychological dynamic of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, and that name carried weight. Captured documents from the period show Viet Cong commanders issuing standing orders. If you encounter Australian forces, withdraw immediately. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Break contact and retreat. These are orders that were never given regarding American forces. Think about that. An enemy that had fought the French to a standstill, that was successfully bleeding American forces through attrition, that believed time was on their side. This enemy was telling its soldiers to avoid Australians at all costs. The numbers back up the reputation. Over 6 years of operations in Vietnam, the Australian SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They operated in confirmed enemy strongholds. They deliberately sought contact in areas where the Viet Cong and NVA felt safe. They accounted for over 500 enemy killed or captured, and they lost 2 men killed in action. 2. In 6 years of operations in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. That's a kill ratio of 164 to 1. For every Australian SAS soldier killed in action, 164 enemy fighters died. No other unit in the Vietnam War, American or Allied, came close to this effectiveness. But statistics only tell part of the story. Let me tell you about Long Tan. August 18, 1966, D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, is sent to investigate enemy activity near a rubber plantation. 108 men. It's supposed to be a routine patrol. They're young soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time. Around 4 in the afternoon, in the middle of a monsoon downpour that turns the rubber plantation into a muddy nightmare, they walk into an ambush. But this isn't a small Viet Cong harassing force. It's a main force regiment, at least 1,500 enemy fighters, possibly 2,500. The Australians are outnumbered more than 20 to 1. Any conventional military wisdom says they should be overrun in minutes. These are overwhelming odds. The enemy has planned this ambush carefully. They have the advantage of numbers, surprise, and terrain. But something happens that the Viet Cong don't anticipate. The Australians don't break. They don't panic. They don't retreat. Instead, they do something that seems insane. They advance into the ambush, toward the enemy, maintaining fire discipline even as bullets strip bark from trees around them, and the rain reduces visibility to meters. They form a defensive perimeter that holds against wave after wave of enemy assault. When ammunition runs low, they redistribute from casualties. When radio communications become difficult due to the storm, they use runners. When artillery support is called in, they bring it so close to their own positions that shells land within meters of their lines. For 4 hours, 108 Australian soldiers hold off a force 20 times their size. The Viet Cong throw everything at them. Human wave attacks, flanking maneuvers, direct assaults meant to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Nothing works. The Australian lines bend, but never break. When relief forces finally arrive with armored personnel carriers, they find D Company still in position, still fighting, still maintaining discipline under fire. The battlefield tells the story. Australian casualties, 18 killed, 24 wounded. Enemy casualties, Australian forces count 245 bodies. The Viet Cong later admit to 47 killed, but that number is certainly understated based on battlefield evidence and the amount of blood trails leading away from the contact area. But here's what matters more than the numbers: the psychological impact. The Viet Cong planned this ambush to destroy an Australian unit and prove that the new arrivals could be beaten. Instead, they learned that Australians don't behave like other forces. They don't break under pressure. They don't retreat from superior numbers. They maintain fire discipline and tactical coherence even in the worst possible conditions. You can outnumber them. You can surprise them. You can hit them with everything you have, and they'll still be there, still fighting, still making you pay for every meter of ground. After Long Tan, Viet Cong units in Phuoc Toi province showed a marked reluctance to engage Australian forces directly. They'd learned a lesson written in blood. The Battle of Coral Balmoral in May and June 1968 reinforced this lesson at an even larger scale. Australian forces established 2 fire support bases to dominate a key area northeast of Saigon. The North Vietnamese Army decided to overrun these bases using regimental strength forces. What followed was nearly a month of sustained combat. The NVA attacked with everything they had: artillery bombardments, coordinated infantry assaults, sappers trying to breach the perimeter. They threw regiment after regiment at Australian positions, and every attack was repulsed. The Australians didn't just defend, they counterattacked, sent out patrols to engage enemy forces before they could organize assaults, used Centurion tanks in offensive operations to break up enemy formations, brought artillery fire so close to their own positions that some rounds landed inside the perimeter. The fighting was intense, close quarters, and absolutely brutal. At one point, 120 Australian soldiers found themselves surrounded by 2,000 NVA troops. Conventional wisdom said they were finished. Instead, they called in artillery danger close, held their positions, and fought until relief arrived. By the end of Coral Balmoral, Australian forces had shattered multiple NVA regiments. The enemy stopped trying to overrun Australian bases. They stopped operating freely in areas under Australian control. They learned that attacking Australians cost more than it was worth. The NVA avoided Phuoc Tuy province for the rest of the war. That's not just tactical success, that's operational dominance. Australian tactics succeeded because they understood something fundamental about guerrilla warfare. The guerrilla wins by making the conventional force react to him. He chooses when to fight. He chooses when to fade away. He controls the tempo. He makes you exhausted, frustrated, and eventually he makes you leave. That's how the Viet Cong defeated the French. That's how they planned to defeat the Americans. But the Australians refused to play that game. They became the guerrillas, 4-man patrols operating deep in enemy territory, silent, patient, invisible. Suddenly, the Viet Cong were the ones being hunted. They were the ones reacting. They were the ones who couldn't predict when and where the enemy would strike. The psychological dynamic reversed completely. The Australians also taught American forces techniques that changed the war at the tactical level. The hunt backwards method became legendary. Traditional tracking is predictable. You find the enemy's trail. You follow it. He knows you're coming because that's what everyone does. He sets an ambush and kills you on ground of his choosing. Hunt backwards reverses this. You study enemy patterns. You learn his routes, his timing, his behavior. Then you predict where he's going next. You get there first. You set the ambush on his trail. He walks into your kill zone thinking he's safe. American long-range reconnaissance patrols that adopted this technique tripled their kill ratios. Green Berets and LRRP teams learned noise discipline from Australian advisors. They learned patience. They learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Just watch. Gather intelligence. Strike only when the tactical advantage is overwhelming. One American operator later said, "The Australians taught us that silence is a weapon, that patience is a tactic, that you don't win by being the loudest or the fastest. You win by being the smartest and the most disciplined." These lessons shaped modern special operations doctrine. Today's special forces around the world use techniques pioneered by Australian SAS in Vietnam. Small team operations, extended patrols with minimal support, emphasis on intelligence gathering over direct action, the understanding that sometimes the most effective thing you can do is observe and report rather than engage. These are Australian innovations, refined in the jungles of Vietnam, now standard practice for elite units worldwide. Let me tell you what Viet Cong fighters said after the war. In interviews conducted decades later, when the political propaganda could be set aside and veterans could speak honestly, they talked about the Australians with a respect that bordered on fear. One former VC officer said, "We knew when Americans were coming. Helicopters, bombs, artillery. Everything was loud. We could hear, we could hide, we could survive. The Australians, we never knew. They would be there, and we would die, and we never heard them coming. We couldn't predict them. We couldn't track them. We couldn't fight what we couldn't see." Another VC fighter described it this way: "American soldiers fought with their equipment. Radios, helicopters, big guns. If you destroyed their equipment or waited for them to leave, you survived. Australian soldiers fought with themselves, their bodies, their minds, their patience. You couldn't wait for them to leave because they never left. They lived in our jungle better than we did. That's what made them terrifying. This is the voice of the enemy, the people who fought them, the people who survived encounters with both American and Australian forces and could compare, and they're telling you that the Australians were different, more dangerous, more feared. The tactical differences weren't subtle. American patrols typically operated for 3 to 5 days before returning to base. Australian SAS patrols routinely stayed out for 2 weeks, sometimes longer. American patrols maintained regular radio contact with headquarters. Australian SAS patrols observed strict radio silence, communicating only when necessary. American patrols moved during the day and established defensive positions at night. Australian SAS moved at night and observed during the day. American patrols carried heavy loads with all their gear. Australian SAS carried minimal equipment, everything stripped down to essentials. No unnecessary weight, nothing that made noise, nothing that revealed their presence. Even their choice of weapons reflected different philosophies. Americans carried the M16 rifle, lightweight, high rate of fire, effective in close combat. Australians carried the L1A1 self-loading rifle, heavier, more powerful, more accurate at range. The weapon choice tells you about tactics. The M16 is designed for engagements where you expect to fire a lot of rounds. The SLR is designed for engagements where every shot matters, where you have one opportunity, where you can't afford to miss, where the first shot decides the outcome. That's Australian warfare in microcosm. One shot, one kill. Precision over volume. Patience over speed. By 1969, Australian tactical dominance in Phuoc Toi province was so complete that Viet Cong activity in the region dropped to its lowest levels of the war. This wasn't because the enemy was defeated, it was because they chose to operate elsewhere. They literally ceded ground rather than continue fighting Australians. Intelligence reports from the period show Viet Cong commanders requesting reassignment to areas facing American forces. They preferred taking their chances against a technologically superior enemy with predictable patterns rather than face a smaller force that fought like ghosts. That's the ultimate metric of tactical effectiveness, making the enemy choose to fight someone else. Australian forces weren't invincible. They took casualties. They had tactical setbacks. They operated in the same brutal, unforgiving environment as everyone else. The jungle doesn't care how well-trained you are. Disease, booby traps, exhaustion, the constant psychological pressure of operating in enemy territory, these affected Australians just like everyone else. The difference was in how they responded to adversity. They adapted, they learned, they refined their techniques. They turned every contact into a lesson, every patrol into training. They maintained standards that never degraded despite the conditions. That's what separates elite forces from everyone else. Not that they don't face problems, but that they solve problems better. The Battle of Binh Ba in June 1969 showed Australian adaptability in a completely different environment. Urban combat, house-to-house fighting in a village that had been occupied by a combined Viet Cong and NVA force. This wasn't jungle warfare, this wasn't their specialty, but when Australian forces swept into Binh Ba, they cleared the village with the same methodical precision they brought to jungle operations, room by room, building by building, using combined arms, infantry and armor working together. It took 2 days. When it was over, Australian casualties, 1 killed, 10 wounded. Enemy casualties, 107 confirmed killed, 6 wounded, 29 captured. The NVA pulled out of the entire region. They'd been beaten so thoroughly in terrain where they should have had every advantage that they decided the area wasn't worth holding. Here's something that often gets lost in discussions of Australian tactical superiority. They achieved these results with a fraction of the resources available to American forces. No massive artillery parks, no fleet of helicopters on call, no B-52 strikes erasing grid squares. They succeeded through fundamental infantry skills, executed at the highest possible level, through discipline that turned men into machines, through patience that allowed them to wait days for the perfect shot, through fieldcraft that made them invisible, through aggression that manifested not in firepower but in relentless, unforgiving pursuit. When they found you, they didn't call in artillery. They killed you themselves, up close, personal, with weapons they carried and skills they'd mastered. That's infantry warfare at its most elementary elemental and most terrifying. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Viet Cong and NVA forces that operated in areas patrolled by Australians developed a hypervigilance that affected their effectiveness. They became cautious, defensive, constantly looking over their shoulders. The hunters' confidence eroded. They started making mistakes, moving at predictable times, using the same trails repeatedly, bunching up for security instead of spreading out. These are symptoms of fear, of an enemy that's been psychologically dominated. And fear makes you vulnerable, makes you easier to kill, makes you lose. Australian forces understood this psychological dimension instinctively. They deliberately cultivated their reputation. Let the enemy know that Australians operated differently. Let stories spread. Let the fear build. Every perfect ambush, every silent kill, every time they appeared where the enemy thought they were safe. It all built a reputation that did as much damage as bullets, because reputation makes the enemy fight worse, makes him hesitant, makes him choose the wrong options because he's reacting to fear rather than thinking tactically. That's operational art, using psychology as a weapon as deliberately as you use rifles and grenades. When Australian forces began withdrawing from Vietnam in 1971, something interesting happened. Viet Cong activity in Phuoc Tuy province immediately increased. Intelligence reports document enemy forces moving back into areas they'd avoided for years. The moment the Australians left, the enemy returned. That tells you everything about the effectiveness of Australian operations. They weren't just winning battles, they were controlling territory through reputation alone. The threat of Australian presence was enough to suppress enemy activity. That's the mark of true tactical dominance. The legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam extends far beyond the war itself. Modern special operations forces worldwide study Australian techniques from this period. The emphasis on small unit tactics, extended patrols with minimal support, silence as a tactical advantage, patience as a weapon. These concepts are now foundational to special operations doctrine. When American Special Forces train for unconventional warfare today, they're learning lessons that Australians perfected in Vietnamese jungles 50 years ago. When British SAS trains for jungle operations, they study Australian tactics. When elite forces worldwide discuss counter-insurgency, they reference Australian operations in Malaya and Vietnam as the gold standard. The men who served in Australian SAS during Vietnam were products of a unique military culture. The ANZAC tradition that goes back to Gallipoli, a national identity built on the idea of the tough, resourceful, uncomplaining soldier who fights like hell and never quits. Australian military history is filled with moments where small forces achieve disproportionate results through sheer determination and tactical skill. Tobruk, El Alamein, Kokoda, Long Tan fits that tradition perfectly. Outnumbered, outgunned, told the situation is hopeless and winning anyway through discipline and refusal to accept defeat. That's not tactics, that's culture. That's national character manifesting on the battlefield. But there's a darker side to this story that deserves acknowledgement. Australian Vietnam veterans came home to a country that didn't want to honor them. The war was unpopular in Australia, just as it was in America. Returning soldiers faced protests, hostility, a society that wanted to forget the war and everyone who fought in it. Men who had performed at the highest levels of military excellence, who had earned the fear and respect of their enemies, came home to indifference or worse. Many struggled with that rejection for decades. PTSD wasn't understood or treated effectively. The nation they'd served didn't give them the recognition they deserved. It took years, decades in some cases, for Australia to properly acknowledge what these men accomplished and what they sacrificed. Today, military historians universally recognize Australian forces in Vietnam as among the most effective combat units of the entire war. Their tactics are studied, their battles are analyzed, their techniques are taught. But during the war and for years afterward, they operated in the shadow of the much larger American effort. The story wasn't told. The lessons weren't widely shared. Only in recent decades has the full picture emerged of just how dominant Australian forces were at the tactical level. How much the enemy feared them, how effective their operations were, how much they achieved with limited resources. The story was always there in the combat records and enemy documents. It just took time for historians to piece it together and for the world to listen. Understanding why the Viet Cong feared Australian SAS more than American forces isn't about diminishing American sacrifice or capability. American forces fought with extraordinary courage in impossible conditions. They faced an enemy that wouldn't quit, political constraints that hamstrung operations, and a strategic situation that made tactical victory nearly meaningless. Thousands of Americans died in Vietnam displaying the same courage and skill as any soldiers in history, but the Australian approach was fundamentally different. Different training, different doctrine, different tactical philosophy, and in the specific conditions of Vietnam, that different approach proved more effective at the tactical and operational level. That's simply historical fact, documented in combat records, enemy accounts, and the analysis of military historians. The question isn't whether American soldiers were brave or capable. They absolutely were. The question is why Australian tactics created a level of enemy fear that American tactics didn't. And the answer comes down to predictability and psychology. American forces, for all their power, fought in ways the enemy could understand and counter. Large operations, massive firepower, predictable patterns. The Viet Cong learned to survive American tactics, but Australian tactics were different enough, alien enough, that the enemy never fully adapted. They couldn't predict Australian movements, couldn't counter Australian fieldcraft, couldn't match Australian patience, and that unpredictability, that feeling of being hunted in your own territory, created a fear that firepower alone never could. In the end, the story of Australian SAS in Vietnam is about mastery of environment, mastery of craft, mastery of self. These were men who turned themselves into apex predators in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, who made the jungle their ally instead of their enemy, who understood that warfare at the highest level isn't about technology or firepower. It's about will, discipline, and the patient application of violence at exactly the right moment. They were phantoms because they chose to be. Because they trained until silence was natural, until patience was instinctive, until reading the jungle was as easy as reading a book. That's not something you can buy with defense budgets. That's something you earn through selection, training, and experience. That's something you prove in combat. And Australian SAS proved it beyond any doubt in the jungles of Vietnam from 1966 to 1971. The Viet Cong gave them the name Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. It was meant as a warning, a way to communicate to other fighters that these enemies were different, more dangerous, to be avoided if possible. But it was also, in its way, a mark of respect, the kind of respect one warrior gives another, the acknowledgement that you've faced someone who beat you at your own game, in your own territory, using your own tactics, but executing them better. That's the highest compliment an enemy can give, fear mixed with respect, the admission that they were simply better. And the combat record proves they were right to be afraid. 164 to 1, 1,200 patrols, 6 years of operations, 2 killed in action. The numbers don't lie. The enemy documents don't lie. The battlefield results don't lie. Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved a level of tactical excellence that stands alone in modern military history. If this deep dive into elite military history resonated with you, subscribe now for more untold stories of tactical brilliance and battlefield courage that changed warfare forever.